last but not least, a really great panel. We started off this morning with election administrators in the real world, went in a little bit into the academy, and now we're coming back into the real world with a panel of really eminent election lawyers. And this panel will be moderated by UC Berkeley's Emily Zhang. So over to you, Emily.
Thanks so much. I'm delighted to be here, and especially delighted to be moderating this panel with lots of folks I've admired for many years, both as a scholar and as a now retired voting rights attorney. I'll start with, we have both, you can see both Janai and Nina on the screen. I'll introduce first both Bob and Ben right next to me. Bob currently teaches at NYU and heads the Legislative and Regulatory Process Clinic. He was also President Obama's White House counsel. Ben Ginsberg has been called by the New York Times the Republican super lawyer that broke with Donald Trump's GOP, a veteran election lawyer who is now at Hoover and co-chairs the Election Officials Legal Defense Network, which I hope we'll hear a little more about. Then we have two of the country's most prominent voting rights attorneys, Janai Nelson, who is the president and director-counsel of LDF, and a UCLA law grad, and Nina Perales, who is the vice president for litigation at MALDEF, the Mexican-American Legal Defense and Education Fund. I'll let folks start with some opening remarks and then hopefully bring them together after those initial remarks. Bob?
Well, thank you. Thank you very much. Those of you want to know whether I think Ben is a super lawyer can meet me out there, right behind there after the session. In any event.
Don't believe everything you read in the New York Times.
Yeah. A lawyer, I'm willing to concede he's a lawyer. In any event, I'm glad to be here on this panel with Ben and the other very fine co-panelists, and appreciate Professor Zhang's moderation. And she invited us to say whatever we wanted to say. Originally, I was going to focus on the role of the practicing lawyer, and I want to say something about that, but in listening to earlier panels, there are just a couple of additional points, one on legitimacy, one on trust, which brings in some work that Ben and I have been doing together and hope to expand in the near future, that I just want to briefly address before turning to the role of the practicing lawyer. And let me start with legitimacy, which is, I think we've heard a lot about legitimacy being an issue very much on the right, election denialism as a product of a particular kind of politics we thought seen in recent years represented, of course, and advanced most aggressively by Donald Trump and those who support Donald Trump and believe that the election was stolen from him in 2020. But this question of legitimacy, I think, haunts the entire body politic, and we could very well see circumstances in which a number of disturbing developments and basic structural critiques of our democracy come together to create a problem, a virulent problem on the left. And the hypothetical that I tend to put to students and others is that Donald Trump runs, he wins, he ekes out a majority in the Electoral College, loses again for the third time by several million votes in the popular vote column, claims the presidency, and calls on everybody to accept the victory. And there will be those who, for many years now, have been opposed to Donald Trump, both as a politician and as what he represents, who are going to simply reject the legitimacy of that presidency. I'm describing something, I'm not glorying in it, I'm not predicting it, I'm simply describing something that I think it is not at all impossible to imagine. The argument would be he wouldn't concede the 2020 election. He set in motion this profound distrust of democratic institutions. Republican legislatures around the country enacted voter suppression statutes, as progressives would describe them. The Republicans blocked voting reform at the national federal level. He reaped the benefit of all of that, and now he's calling everybody together to recognize a presidency that I suspect in 2024 is going to emerge, whoever wins, from a campaign that is very, very ugly. And I think that we could imagine that there will be significant resistance on the left in this instance, among Democrats, to the call to honor norms and recognize that the system we have is the system we have, and that if he emerges as the winning candidate, he is the winner again. I'm not embracing that view. I'm not predicting that outcome, but I think everybody could recognize it's not unrealistic. And I think we need to be deeply concerned about it. And it brings in not just what we know about some of the last 2 years of attacks on the electoral system. It brings in critiques of fundamental constitutional structures that we've had, that we've lived with and accepted, like, for example, that a popular vote loser could win in the Electoral College, that combines with these other concerns to create a very dangerous situation for the acceptance of democratic governance in the United States. The second point on trust, Charles Stewart made the point that there's a question about trust in the elected system. Who do we trust to stand behind that system, to stand for validation of the system? And of course, election officials have been under siege. Very important to the defense of these election officials, but ultimately very important to promoting trust in the electoral process, is the role of civil society, of leadership in communities at the state and local level, Democratic or Republican in their own affiliations, who are prepared to stand up for the electoral process, who get to know the election administrative process, make it their business to know the electoral administrative process at the state and local level, and who are willing to then stand up and speak to the public from a nonpartisan vantage point, because they're not identified in their leadership by affiliation with either parties. They're leaders in the faith community, the education community, the labor community, the business community, and stand against those who decide that if they didn't win an election, then it couldn't have been fair and that the system is rotten and untrustworthy. Ben Ginsberg and I and other, in our organizational work and in the work, we see this in the work of other organizations as well, are looking to spend a decent amount of time going around the country, and we started doing that, trying to rally bipartisan leadership in the communities to stand behind nonpartisan professional election administration by coming together with election officials to understand the system and then be in a position to defend it when these attacks develop. And then last thing, which was actually going to be the first and only thing, the role of practicing lawyers. I just want to say that was originally one of the items this panel would address. What is the role of practicing lawyers? As we discussed previously, the role of norms, the role of politics, the role of election law. Very quickly, I just want to say one thing about, for want of a better term, the politics that election lawyers, practicing lawyers need to support. So there's one view that I hear from my students that lawyers relate to the electoral process and to democracy form primarily through the venue of litigation, litigating voting rights. And we have some outstanding practitioners on this panel who have done a great deal of work and good work in that space. And that's obviously very, very important. But at the same time, we also have to recognize that we're not going to litigate our way through this crisis for a variety of reasons. This litigation is essential in many respects to prevent completely unjustified, unconstitutional, illegal, discriminatory attempts to prevent the exercise of the franchise. But we also know that we are not living in a world where we can expect a favorable judicial response in all circuits, and for that matter, in the Supreme Court of the United States. That litigation, perpetual litigation, and we have seen so much of it since Rick Hasen published the first of his volumes on this topic. I think the first one was entitled The Voting Wars. Litigation has become a really fixed feature in a way it wasn't long ago in my career, shortly before it's, when it started, shortly before the First World War. And now there's there were over, on one study, speaking just now of affirmative litigation to open up channels of voting, a study that Ben and I have been working on, there were over 100 cases that were brought on just that side, just attempts to liberalize rules or, to open up channels of voting, affirmative, if you will, voter protection litigation as opposed to defensive litigation. And this takes place all the way through the election cycle. I know from the Biden campaign all the way up to Election Day. And it creates both some very good results. It also creates burdens on election officials. It creates instability for field operations trying to know the rules so that they can get people to the polls on an understanding of what the law is. And it creates confusion for voters. Some of it absolutely essential, much of it part of a heavy, heavy background noise that creates, I think in its own way, some distrust of the system. And of course, as I said, there are practitioners like the ones on this panel today who've performed at a very high level in this area, but I'm speaking generally about litigation as a field. But there are other things that practicing lawyers need to do. That is to find and help support unique ways of educating voters and connecting with voters in a viral environment, misinformation environment. Education to voters who are going to be subjected to falsehoods and misleading claims about the electoral process. Election lawyers play a very important role in defending election officials and defending institutions that administer our elections. And of course, practicing lawyers play an enormous role in supporting the field operations of campaigns and parties that are looking to expand access to the franchise rather than restrict it. So that's it.
Thank you, Bob. Ben?
Well, thank you. Thank you for having me, having us. Thanks to Rick for putting on the conference, for the generous introduction. That's meant to Emily and not you, by the way.
Yeah, I know that.
Yeah. So let me approach this a little bit differently. And while I've enjoyed the past few years in academia, I really was a practitioner for far longer than that. And so this is a practitioner's viewpoint of the situation. And I think there are 3 points to trying to survive the 2024 election. Number one is, on a very practical basis, we have to bolster the election officials who are the front line, who have behaved and acted so courageously. You heard from Stephen and Jocelyn and Neil this morning. They are representative of a group of people who have really sacrificed a lot. And so that's what Bob and I are trying to do with the Election Officials Legal Defense Network and the Pillars of the Community in terms of providing pro bono legal services to election officials under attack, to providing communications, crisis communications help through political veterans who understand crisis communications, through some affirmative litigation, particular state laws that are aimed at election officials and punishing them for the jobs that they actually do, and what we call the Pillars of the Community program, which is going in and providing support in the community, among leaders in the communities, for election officials. Jocelyn Benson described what they're doing in Michigan and all 88 counties. That is a perfect model, one that we hope to either utilize for the first time in states or to reinforce when the states are doing it. That goes to the second point of surviving the elections, which is, to be honest, the problem of election denialism is not going to be dealt with on a national basis. It is too poisonous an atmosphere. It is far too general. The efforts that we support need to be local, and it needs to be very community-based, because the truth of the matter is that stability is good for local communities. And instability has actually become quite a feature of our national politics and many of the models that the political actors are engaging in. So you need to go local. And number three, and this is going to be the most controversial of the 3 ways, there has to be a dialogue with the election deniers. The whole process of fighting disinformation since the 2020 election, which is basically to sort of push away people in the 25 to 30% who don't believe in our elections, has not worked. The polling numbers tell you that. Sarah Longwell's presentation today told you that. There is sort of an appetite to just push away the 25 to 30% as opposed to engaging in the conversation that election officials were talking about they're doing successfully on the local level. What Stephen described that he did in Maricopa and Jocelyn and Neil described, absolutely crucial. And that is the reaching out to people who doubt in the system. And what I think we need to do for 2024 is to be really local and get the pillars of the community to support, but it involves talking to them. So I have deeply enjoyed this conference, gotten a lot of good ideas out of it, but honestly, this is not a room, and conferences at law schools and convenings do not look like America today. And if we're going to solve this problem, it's important to actually sort of understand what the people who do not have faith in our elections are thinking. So Sarah Longwell is doing some great work in that, but that's really what's incumbent upon the academy and nonprofits, is to start reaching out a little more, because kicking the other side in a polarized society is not going to make things better. And that essentially is the majority of the language that you hear in far too many quarters. And so that goes to the reaching out. There's also a crisis of faith in the system, and the reasons for that are important to explore, and the symptoms of that are important to explore. There's no question that what happened in 2016 with Donald Trump is what sort of started this bad chain going. I spent 38 years working in election day operations for the Republican Party. That meant being in precincts and looking at polls. It meant looking for the fraud that Donald Trump claimed was there. The bottom line is you have to be honest about the evidence, and there is no evidence of fraud. There's a report done earlier by a group of conservatives that I was honored to be a part of called Lost Not Stolen. It examined all the claims that had been made by Trump and his supporters in the litigation after 2020. There is no evidence of fraud, and it's important to say that. But on the other hand, while there may not be evidence of fraud, as you have heard from many, we are not out of the woods. Larry Diamond correctly said that I have a somewhat more colorful phrase for not out of the woods. Because we are being live streamed and not under Chatham House rules, we'll forego that explanation. Rest assured, it had some words in it that are shorter than woods. And so with that, I think one of the main things to study really in terms of election administration that so many really excellent scholars led by Charles Stewart are doing is to recognize that what the political parties are doing in terms of the way they do turnout is the epitome of why we are so polarized. That unfortunately, fraud and suppression has seeped into the turnout models of both political parties and many nonprofit groups, and those messages sort of contribute to the real hate by one side for the other. So if I were going to look at some academic things to study this time, it really goes to the turnout models of the party, to fraud and suppression, dueling legislation, the litigation that Bob mentioned, in which I think both parties are bringing cases that are not really going to help them at all politically or legally, and end up setting bad precedents. So we have a lot of work to do, but there is hope in terms of doing this very much on a local level in a way that helps out our election administrators.
Thanks so much. Now I turn it over to Janai. Janai, I should describe the way you appear at the moment. You and Nina are hovering above us in a two-paneled window.
Well, I hope we're not too blown up on the screen. That's never too flattering. But in any event, I'm grateful to be here and to be part of this conversation about the role of lawyers in elections. And I will say that I think lawyers have an outsized role in elections. And that may sound a little bit controversial, but I say it because I believe that organizations like the Legal Defense Fund, like the Mexican American Legal Defense and Educational Fund, and like so many other peer organizations have to expend untold resources to protect and defend our democracy because we don't have the appropriate laws and legal apparatus in place to do it without those very costly, time-consuming interventions. So I would very much love to have less of a role in protecting elections. And I would love to be able to expend those resources on other issues of systemic racism and societal inequities. But unfortunately, given that the right to vote is preservative of all rights, and we are doing everything we possibly can to give the voices in our electorate the wherewithal to cast a ballot that will be counted and ultimately will determine, who is in power in our representative democracy, we have to focus a lot on ensuring election integrity in the true meaning of that word, ensuring that the people who turn out to vote have equal access to the ballot and that they vote within a system that isn't already rigged or formed by partisan lockup, so that even if they are able to cast a ballot that is counted, it is counted within the confines of districting lines and other electoral practices and policies that still make their vote not equal to others in our society. So at the Legal Defense Fund, we are actively engaged in election protection efforts every election cycle. Our work used to be centered mainly around mainly around the general elections or elections that we knew were likely to be subject to very direct voter suppression efforts. We now find ourselves involved in elections year-round and having to police and monitor local, state, and federal elections because of the onslaught of attacks, in significant part fueled by the removal of Section 4 from the Voting Rights Act and the disabling of Section 5 as a result, so that there are many voting laws that are now in the stream of our election process that frankly should never have been there and would not have been there had we had pre-clearance as part of our system of checks and balances when it comes to protecting our elections. So the role of lawyers has become much more central, but I should note lawyers like the ones at LDF and the ones at MALDEF and our sister organizations are not the only lawyers in the game. We also have lawyers who are representing parties and don't always represent the interests of voters. We have lawyers who represent candidates and who, as we know, in connection with the last president, filed nearly 70 lawsuits that were frivolous, in my view, and certainly many judges seem to think so as well, because he did not succeed in, I think, all but one, and even that one did not go far. So the idea that lawyers are central to our elections now is really a complex statement, because you're talking about litigation from every possible angle with very different interests in mind, which makes elections that much more costly all around. I think that this is a very disturbing state of affairs. I think that that fact alone demands that we have legislation like the John R. Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act and the Freedom to Vote Act to try to control and put in place some standards and mechanisms for our voting system and our electoral processes that are not litigable or not debatable at this point, or not manipulable. There's certain ways in which voters should be able to rely on the system itself to protect them, and not the ability to be represented by lawyers of any association. So I'm concerned about the continued growing role of lawyers in our elections process. There should always be an opportunity for redress if there's a violation. Obviously, we believe in the prosecution of civil rights laws and think that it's important, and the rights of candidates and the rights of parties even. But at this stage, we are in a moment of a true legal frenzy when it comes to our elections, and it makes them that much more unpredictable. It makes them very, I think, uninviting for many voters when there isn't a clear determination of an election outcome when they participate in an election. It's one thing if it happens, from time to time, that there's a close call, or there needs to be a runoff because of, the different mechanisms of elections working in a way that require it. But we're seeing this far, far, far too often, and the outcomes are just too uncertain. And that is fertile ground for people to doubt the integrity of the election and for election sabotage to occur when you have mis and disinformation that result from a very chaotic elections process. I think an important role of lawyers who do the work that we do is to make sure that this very grim reality doesn't dissuade people from turning out, that we are still able to educate voters, empower them with the information that they need to overcome the obstacles that are erected on their path to voting, and not be overwhelmed by the process. And I would say that holds equally true for candidates who are interested in enacting laws that will protect our democracy, who represent the interests of the communities that we serve, are often deterred by the messiness of this process. And it's important that lawyers do everything that they can to help them navigate that process and encourage them to continue to be willing to be the public servants that we need them to be in order to enact the legislation that will protect our democracy. So there are lots of different roles that lawyers can play. I hope that they are reduced as we move towards enacting legislation that we need, but it won't happen before 2024 in all likelihood, unless something, cataclysmic that I can't predict changes in our Congress. And I think it's important that we just gear up for what will inevitably be a very serious battle for our democracy as we approach the next general election.
Thanks so much. Nina?
Thank you very much for including me. It's a privilege to be on this panel with such wonderful and accomplished lawyers. And thank you also for letting me do this remotely as well. I'd like to focus on one aspect of our experience with 2020 election misinformation. And that's the claim that fraudulent voting by non-US citizens stole the 2020 election from Donald Trump. Many of Trump's claims of having votes stolen from him or fraudulent votes cast for his opponent involved claiming that non-US citizens illegally cast ballots for his opponent. This was something that he said before and after the 2020 election. In 2017, Trump famously claimed that between 3 and 5 million undocumented immigrants, he didn't use that phrase, but between 3 and 5 million undocumented immigrants voted for Hillary Clinton, robbing him of the popular vote in the presidential election. Remember, at that time, he was really focused on the popular vote. Now, after the 2020 election, Trump tweeted that the massive voter fraud in swing states, which should prevent certification of the election results, included illegal immigrants voting fraudulently. He also claimed that fraudulent votes, including votes by illegal immigrant voters, were, quote, far greater than what is necessary to win the individual swing states. Also, after the 2020 election, we saw lots of social media users circulating things on Facebook and Instagram, including a very old image that had gone around before, wrongly claiming that 22 million illegal aliens living in America and voting illegally. The toxic blend of nativism and false claims of voter fraud has now moved into the mainstream political discourse, I think largely as a result of Trump's pushing of this narrative, right? So first, he continues himself to push these messages. In April of 2022, in the lead up to the midterms, he was at a rally in Delaware, Ohio. He called for stricter voter ID laws and proof of citizenship at the polling place to prevent, quote, open borders and horrible elections, unquote. But you'll also hear people using terms like vote trafficking. Now, instead of vote harvesting, vote trafficking, comparing voter outreach organizations, community groups to the Mexican mafia. referring to people who drop ballots into drop boxes as mules. So a lot of the sort of terminology is blending, you know, words about crime, about drugs, about Latinos, about immigration, kind of all into a sort of a bad ball. We also have, speaking of mainstream, at least here in Texas, our Lieutenant Governor, Dan Patrick, has repeatedly and publicly echoed the Great Replacement Theory, which espouses that non-Anglo undocumented immigrants are being ushered into the United States so they can drive the outcome of elections, specifically so they can drive the outcome of elections, right? And all of this is spreading into policy proposals that make it harder for everyone to vote. These are not just policies that make it difficult to vote for low-income voters who may have less access to transportation or money to purchase ID, or even voters with lower educational achievement who can experience more barriers navigating complicated forms or bureaucracies, but policies aimed specifically at immigrant voters. We're seeing a push again in legislatures to impose documentary proof of citizenship for voter registration. When this was adopted in Arizona, we had tens of thousands of people having their voter registration forms rejected, mostly white folks, honestly, because they were the majority of registrants in Arizona at the time. But we also have in Texas a new law that restricts assistance to voters. And most of the folks who are getting assistance in Texas, at least, are older folks who need help navigating the voting process, and a lot of Latinos who don't speak English very well. The claim being that these votes are illegitimate, either because the voter lacked qualification or was somehow manipulated, right? We also have litigation going on right now against the state of Arkansas related to their voter assistance barriers. And we're meeting the same arguments that folks should not be receiving language assistance in the polling place because there's something illegitimate about their voting, because they're immigrants. These two ideas, fear of immigrants and false claims of election fraud, feed on each other and are mutually enforcing in many cases. And as a result, we're seeing the spread of the false and destructive narrative, not only into popular political discourse, but also into policy proposals that are specifically targeting immigrant voters. Thank you.
Thanks so much. So I have a couple of questions that came up from the various comments. The first is, as a part of Bob's sort of apocalyptic situation, not just in the result, a potential result in 2024, but an apocalyptic process, a very contentious election, a very dirty election. And one thing to throw in the nightmare scenario, in addition to what he's already mentioned, might be the presence of voter intimidation, which I understand to be more and more a prominent part of voting rights lawyering today. And I'm curious, to hear from folks about the effect that that would have on the legitimacy of various election results, if that were to occur during elections, which we know have become more prominent, as well as the lawsuits that have been brought to try and, bring actions against those who've sought to intimidate voters.
Good. You started this.
I just want to make sure, did you say voter manipulation?
Voter intimidation.
Voter intimidation,
So
I'm sorry.
in addition to sort of dirty campaign tactics, the presence of folks in polling locations, as we saw, or at least were concerned with in the last election in 2020, trucks being driven in particular ways, messages, banners flown at various polling locations as an attempt to intimidate voters. How would that affect the legitimacy of, the election, especially if that intimidation were aligned with one particular candidate, and if that candidate were to win according to the rules of the game in that election?
So that fits in very much with my suggestion that there's this important community organizing component in which, first of all, there clearly are in some cases violations of law, and they are going to get addressed by the legal corps that support parties and campaigns and voting, the ones that represent voting rights organizations. But there's also, and we've certainly seen this in campaigns, a part of this where you have to have early dialogue with law enforcement about what the community needs to hear about the consequences of certain kinds of behavior, and then you have to have protocols set up for acting on reports of voter intimidation, so the word spreads very quickly that if it occurs, it will be addressed. And I think, again, we're back to something about having trusted institutions within the community backing up these messages. Voters will hear certain messages from Democrats and they'll hear certain messages from Republicans, but that's messages in the partisan crossfire. But I think it's very important, and we saw some of this, by the way, in the last election. I was thinking particularly about intimidation activities around drop boxes, where there just needed to be a broader voice that voters could trust, that we don't do things this way. This does not work. You know, whether you're a Democrat, whether you're a Republican, you're a Trump supporter, a Biden supporter, or something in between, these attacks on the voters, this kind of intimidation activity that you're referring to that can occur in a number of forms, is just not acceptable. And that message has to go out early, and it has to be something around which there is very concrete organizing to make sure that if it happens, it's identified and immediately assistance is available. And then the word, as I said, begins to spread that there's going to be a response to this. And therefore, the people who haven't yet done it but are planning to do it have second thoughts.
I think all that's right. I mean, the question is, how do you stop it and who does the response come from? And I think that's what we wrestle with a lot. I mean, if we're worried about armies of lawyers battling with each other and the impact that has on voter turnout and voter participation and ultimately the legitimization of the results and acceptance of the results, it almost becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. That's kind of why the work that we're doing urges a step back from this national battleground and a real concentration on the local communities that are going to be most in the crosshairs, simply because the local communities have the greatest stake in maintaining stability for themselves. So I think it's a real concern. I think the solutions, we tend to look at this through the parties and through national organizations. The work they do is important, but this has got to get done on the local level by leaders of communities recognizing that and investing in their own places.
I'd like to add the law that I was talking about that was recently enacted in Texas that restricted voter assistance also has provisions that now prevent election judges, what we call election judges, which are polling place workers, polling place clerks, from removing unruly poll watchers. So in the lead up to this bill, there was a narrative that poll watchers were, really just there to do a very neutral job. And it was all these terrible election workers who were forcing them out. So the new law in Texas criminalizes activity by poll workers when they impaired free movement through the poll, if they tried to eject or not accept a poll watcher. So the narrative has been flipped in Texas, where the good guys are the poll watchers, who are generally designated by candidates or campaigns and can sometimes get a little, over excited in their functions. And the bad guys now are the election workers who've been doing it, for years and years and years, who are trying to place limits on the poll watchers.
Yeah, I just wanted to underscore that, the example that Nina mentions, a lot of this will be tested in our courts. And, Bob talked about, I think you were referring to what happened in Arizona, where you had armed persons in tactical gear filming voters and following their cars when they attempted to cast a ballot in a secure drop box. And we probably, if you were following the case, you probably recall that initially the judge said that, allowed that activity to go forward, and then a few days later ultimately banned it. And it was really important. I do think it had that messaging effect that Bob referred to in potentially deterring others. I feel pretty confident that if that were allowed to continue, we would have seen a proliferation of that leading up to the election, and certainly more preparation for it for the 2024 election. That doesn't mean that there isn't some other scheme in being planned as we speak. But the courts have a central role to play in curbing some of these violations, and especially in the laws like Nita described, how broadly we're going to interpret them and what rights we're going to extend to people who may want to manipulate these laws to interfere with elections.
Thank you. So I had a second sort of related to the role of lawyers, maybe the role of courts and judges in response to the litigation that was brought by the Trump campaign and those aligned with the Trump campaign. There were a series of lawsuits that were brought, some referred to them as frivolous, and the role that judges played in stating on the record that there wasn't any fraud akin to some of the investigation that Ben was referring to, in some cases imposing Rule 11 sanctions. And I'm curious about what you think the importance of those decisions might be.
What the effect of the decision would be? I think that I'm not sure how to characterize the Trump legal effort at the end of 2020. Let's put it this way, it's very difficult to win these cases when you have neither the facts nor the law on your side. And the absolute absence of any merit, I think in this particular instance, I think spelled doom for the many lawsuits that were filed. There was almost a theatrically clownish quality to some of it. I mean, everybody's well aware of peculiar press conferences and parking lots that were confused with luxury hotels, and any number of other things that just cast an air of absurdity, if you will, over all of it. And I think we should not assume that we are going to see something quite like that the next time around. I mean, already there are, speaking of litigation, there are groups springing up, one in particular that former Attorney General Bill Bauer is involved with, springing up to litigate voting rules on the conservative/Republican side. I'm not going to say the Trump side, but certainly looking to challenge voting rules as being too expansive or too subject to potential fraud versus lawsuits on the other side that are meant to liberalize access. I think there will be a different core of lawyers active in that space in 2024, and there's all sorts of opportunities for courts to render troubling decisions in very, very different circumstances. I don't think, obviously everybody's enormously grateful that the court stood up to what I think was plainly nonsense in 2020, destructive nonsense for that matter, not just laughing matter. But I think it would be a mistake to say we're going to see a replay of a legal effort on the denialist side or on the vote restrictive side in 2024 that looks at all like 2020.
I think that's right, but I think that's mostly because it wasn't successful, which will probably lead to something of a change in tactics. I'm not sure I would put the Bill Barr group in that category. I mean, there is a legitimate legal question, sometimes called the independent state legislature theory, on whether a legislature passes a law, whether a judge can basically come up with his own legislative solution to that or change in that in the name of a remedy. And that is a legitimate legal question that still requires answering by the Supreme Court ultimately. And I think the litigation that involves upholding state laws is categorically different from the Trump legal show post-election, which was basically recounts and contests and challenging the way that the elections were conducted. I am doubtful that the threat of rural election sanctions will necessarily stand in the way of filing those suits. It might, I think, might actually try and do something like real evidence as opposed to whatever it was they came up with in many of those cases. But this whole kind of litigation circus that we're entering into is certainly not going to have the effect of encouraging voters to get out to vote and providing additional faith in the system.
Another theme that's come up is the importance that lawyers can play as trusted messengers in an environment of misinformation and disinformation. And something that I've sort of been thinking about is the credibility of lawyers is both very powerful but also quite fragile in certain instances, because lawyers can be seen as advocates for one side as opposed to neutral parties. And I'm curious about sort of your various views, given your experience on the ground, talking to folks in affected communities, what lawyers can do to both gain trust in this difficult environment and also to lose it.
You want me to start? I'd just say very briefly, I mean, I think this is where the voting rights community plays a very important role. They can't just hear from Democrats and Republicans. They have to hear from people who are representing or defending voters, either in targeted communities or across the board. And I think that, in context, provides lawyers in that role with a significant amount of credibility, because they're standing somewhat outside of the basic partisan conflict. That isn't to say, I mean, I'm a Democratic lawyer. It's not to say Democratic lawyers aren't trustworthy.
Thanks for the opening.
Unless, I might say, unless provoked. But the other point I would make very, very quickly, and I'm obviously interested in what the other panelists have to say on this, the other point is I do think that, and this is difficult because I know I'm sure I've been guilty of it. I can't imagine looking back over things that I've said that have popped into the press on behalf of clients. And maybe sometimes, this also spills over into Twitter and television commentary. And that is that there is a responsibility, I think, of lawyers to be somewhat thoughtful and restrained in the claims that they're making, in the way that they're describing what's really at stake in a lawsuit, and what motivations are challenging on the other side, assuming there's anything to be said and sort of neutrally about those motivations. And I think if you have a lot of lawyers all screaming at the top of their lungs and saying things that clearly it's just going to add, as Ben just said, to general voter mistrust and, frankly, discouragement, I think that's an unconstructive role for lawyers to play.
So I've seen a lot of preliminary work on who trusted messengers are about elections, mostly geared towards how you convince election deniers, who are they going to listen to? And lawyers should stand out of the way, because it's not lawyers who are trusted sources on this subject. It honestly is people in the community who are sort of the pillars of the community. I mean, interestingly enough, medical personnel, if you can get them to talk about elections being credible, are really the most listened to voices in a community. Teachers, faith leaders, it's not lawyers.
I will add, oh, go ahead, Janai. Go ahead.
Oh, thanks, Nina. I think that's generally right, but I would say that there are a band of lawyers who have worked very hard to gain the trust of communities, and it's always important to have reinforcing voices. But when you are in a community, as I said, not just when there are general elections, but year-round, when the community is relying on you for information about changes in polling sites, or what a new voting law means, or what the effect of a lawsuit is, and you can deliver that information with accuracy and make it accessible and intelligible, lawyers can have credibility. But this is in no way to suggest that we should be the only ones speaking. I agree that there are trusted voices, and we need to expand who those trusted voices are and make that information much more accessible. I can say for organizations like the Legal Defense Fund, another dimension of that is making sure that we underscore that our work is completely nonpartisan. We have sued Republicans and Democrats. We represent Black communities and Black voters, and we make that very clear that the aim is to give those voters an equal opportunity to cast a ballot that will be counted. And I think saying that often is very important, not just for people beyond the Black community, but for people in the Black community to understand that we are not caping for any party or any candidate, but very much there to support their exercise of a constitutional right. I'll say the other thing I wanted to just circle back to the point that you asked, Emily, about the faith in courts and judges and so forth. And I will note, and this isn't a partisan comment, but it does, I think, make the role of courts more more reliable for the general public when they see that judges are not voting along party lines, even when they depart from the party of the president that may have nominated them. And we did see that in the decision of the 60-odd lawsuits that were filed by Trump. Many of his own appointees and nominees voted against his election efforts, and that did something to restore some confidence in our judiciary.
I just wanted to pick up on something that Janai had said earlier and that Bob said a moment ago, which has to do with, the partisan voices or partisan lawyers kind of putting out a kind of a narrative that isn't always helpful for turning out voters or engaging voters in communities of color. And I can think of examples from both political parties. When Democrats say, very broadly, oh, your vote is being stolen, your vote is being taken, your vote is being suppressed, that, reiterating that over and over and over again can have a depressing effect on voters that you may want to feel engaged enough to want to look up, how am I going to participate? Where is my polling place? What is the deadline to register? What do I need to do, right? And I don't know who decided that was an effective message. Maybe it works with like mid-level propensity voters. I don't think it works with low propensity voters at all. But similarly, on the Republican side, we had a lot of kind of talk in the 2020 election cycle about how voting by mail was a bad idea and you had to go vote in person, right? Well, there were a lot of older people in the Latino community, some of whom may have wanted to vote, Republican, who were hearing this message. And I don't think it was helping them, feel confident in casting a ballot by mail, right? And of course, it was the middle of the pandemic. People did not want to get out and about. Certainly my elderly parents did not want to be out and about, walking in crowded polling places. So I think that voices that come from political parties may have a reason that they're saying what they're saying, but it isn't necessarily the message that voters who work in lawyers who work in communities of color want to put forward to make sure that our community feels engaged and effective when they go and vote.
Thank you. I'm going to now open it up to folks who have questions in the spirit of letting as many people participate as possible. If folks have questions, I think we have one.
Sure, great.
Yeah.
Hi, thank you. This is a wonderful panel. My name is David Daly. I'm a journalist and a fellow at Fair Vote. I'm also curious about the role of judges. And really what I'd be interested in hearing everybody talk about is just how politicized the process of confirming judges has become, whether we trace this back to Robert Bork or the more current fights and the efforts to put folks on the bench who we understand how they're likely to rule on cases. And I guess I wonder, have the courts and the way that we have politicized that process poured gasoline onto our democratic crisis? Really, what's the intersection of our democratic crisis, the battle for the courts, and some of the decisions that we have seen come down on voting rights that have really seemed to line up in some ways through partisan eyes?
Well, I don't think it's the root cause. I think the confirmation process has certainly gotten more and more polarized, and probably the Bork confirmation is the right starting point for that. And it doesn't help anything, but it's a symptom of the larger polarization disease, and not, I don't think judicial confirmations caused the polarization in the country.
Great. Should we take another question from the left this time?
Question. primarily for the Zoom speakers, but because I'm interested in the communities that you represent, their take on police officers, sheriff's deputies generally involved in the voting process, and whether they are a deterrent to the process or a securer of the right. Has that shifted at all? Because I will tell you, with respect to the people dressed in camouflage and tactical gear outside the ballot boxes, we had a hard time deciding what to do and how many law enforcement members to send out there, because we didn't want to make it seem like a militarized zone either, with a bunch of police officers and police presence. And so is there a shifting perception of that, and just sort of how do you have a sense of, or a statistical sense of, how communities view that these days?
Let me just add, I think this is also to tack on to sort of what Ben was saying. If work needs to be done ex ante, far in advance, to address voter intimidation, what role does the police officer or the police, the sheriff's office play in building that relationship far in advance? Yeah.
I can start. I think it depends a lot on the relationship that a given community has with its law enforcement, and also the presence of other neutral parties in the presence of law enforcement as well, so that there are witnesses, there are other trusted members, and the volume of police officers there. So it's a complicated situation, and it's one that extends beyond elections. It's a real crisis in many communities across the country who don't have a relationship of trust with law enforcement for very good reason. And even when they do need some intervention to protect their fundamental right, they also don't want to put themselves in harm's way and risk further violation by engaging with law enforcement. So I don't have a statistical answer for you. I can say that it's something that we think about quite a bit and try to engage. I can't remember who said it early, but to the extent that we do need to have conversations with the law enforcement community beforehand, that you do that and you try to suss out how best to do this with the right presence, both in terms of volume, who's there, what familiarity they have with community members. Is there a particular unit that is more community-based and community-friendly to participate in election protection?
I agree. I mean, I've heard from voters who said that if they saw police outside a polling place, they would turn around and leave. But also under our new law in Texas, if an election worker wants to remove a poll watcher who's gotten out of hand and they didn't personally witness whatever the improper activity was, the only solution is to call the police now. And have them come to the polling place. That's the new structure that we have in Texas. So I think police are going to get called when there are situations more than before. And I don't know exactly what kind of effect that's going to have on voters when they see police cars. I think Janai's right. It probably has a lot to do with how many police cars they see. What are the police officers doing? What's going on? Because people could just assume like, oh, there's like an operation here involving police. The line's going to take forever. I'm just going to leave and try to go somewhere else. There are different reasons why that might be a deterrent.
We will take one last very brief question.
Thank you. I'm wondering, in response to some of the frivolous litigation out of 2020, as you mentioned, there was one effort to win sanctions in court from judges, but there was another effort to win sanctions and even disbarment within bar associations. And I'm wondering, based on that experience, if you think the legal profession is able to, regulate itself, and whether that is a route that's worth pursuing.
I had a little trouble hearing the question. Could you repeat it?
It's about the role that disbarment, in addition to Rule 11 sanctions, might have in dissuading folks to participate in the sort of lawsuits that occurred from the Trump side after the election.
The effect of the disciplinary rules.
Correct.
Well, so I think that you've got to sort out the cases a little bit. There is a right under state laws to bring recounts and contests in disputed places. And there were some close elections where it was legitimate to bring the cases. Now, the bar actions are a little bit of a sort of a Gatling gun going off at any Trump lawyer. So that I think the efforts that are being staged by groups to try and disbar like too many Trump lawyers who got engaged in litigation that they lost is probably going to be misplaced and not work. But there certainly were some egregious cases where litigants didn't have any evidence, misrepresented evidence. And if a few of those produce the results of disciplinary actions, that'll probably have a salutary effect. But I think the breadth of the charges that are being made looks more like a political vendetta than a proper bar disciplinary action.
All right, I'm delighted to end this panel on time, upholding the virtuous norm that Rick has helped develop for conferences. Please join me in thanking all of our panelists for an excellent discussion.
Thanks. This was a great panel. I learned a lot today. The good news is that there were some suggestions for reform and not just a look back at the past. And there will be a group of us, as in 2020, that will be trying to hammer out some recommendations, and we hope to issue a report in the fall. And this is something, and it was really Sarah Longwell's last answer, where she looked to the future, as opposed to just being worried about the past, that now's the time to be active and to think proactively. So I thank all of you. I thank all of the people that made this possible today, the audiovisual people, the people who made our food and served our food, all of the staff at UCLA Law. Thank you all. Your reward is that if you go out this door and turn that way on the terrace, there's a reception with some alcohol. So see you out there. Thank you all.